Well, first I'd like to mention that several of the slides that you're going to see were contributed by Bill Conroy, Jack Sleeper, Mike Northrup, and Dan Sagata, and I'd like to give them credit for their work. The question that I have, of course, theory to practice. The question is dealing with riparian areas and early seral stage, and can we manage for more than big trees? Good place to start is with the aquatic conservation strategy of the Northwest Oregon Plan. And in blue, I've highlighted some things that are, I cherry-picked from this. There wasn't enough room to display much of what's in the aquatic conservation strategy, but some things that were specific to riparian vegetation. Yes, we do have direction to restore riparian vegetation, and that's a pretty big context of what can be done. And not specific to big trees. But a little further down, you'll see that, yes, we were directed to, we have the opportunity to restore large conifer trees in riparian areas, and also to thin, densely stocked young conifer stands with the intention of developing larger conifers. So we were given the direction and the opportunity to do those things. If you'll notice at the very top of this slide, I have riparian reserves, key watersheds, and watershed analysis. Those were 3 out of 4 of the components of the aquatic conservation strategy. And really, when you get down to deciding what's going to happen at a landscape level or a site-specific level, watershed analysis and planning for the landscape management project are what's really going to dictate what you're going to do at that site level. And these are just some of the opportunities that you would have in the landscape management arena. So the question, and to answer that question, can we manage for more than big trees? The answer that I have really is no. No, we can't. And I'd say that we have in the past, but it's very, very difficult to do that now. It's difficult to manage riparian areas, period, let alone for big trees. And the reason I'd point out for you is on the Oregon coast, on the Siuslaw Forest, it has to do with coho salmon, with the short-term risk of impacts to juvenile coho salmon rearing in almost all of our streams. And I know there was a study done it was commissioned by Oregon Department of Forestry several years ago. They wanted to know how abundant cutthroat trout were in coastal watersheds. And what they found was that a catchment area as small as 100 acres would have approximately an 80% chance of having cutthroat in it. There are fish almost everywhere in the Oregon coast. Lots of fish and lots of perennial stream. But it really is the coho salmon habitat that's driving what we can and can't do. And with each consultation, we're getting just a little bit closer to no effect, and the conservation recommendations that we're receiving are pushing us further and further away from being able to actively manage riparian vegetation. Really what we're being moved towards would be what I'd call passive restoration, where we really step back and do nothing and let time do the management for us. Highlighted here are some of the directions we received in the latest consultation we have back on a landscape management project. It was the West Alsea Little Nestucca projects. We were directed, as you can read, within a site potential tree height, which for us is approximately 250 feet, 200 trees per acre is what we were being directed to thin to. And within 100 feet of occupied coho habitat, we really weren't allowed to thin at all. In the terms and conditions, which are binding, as you might know, the conservation recommendations, it's highly suggested that you follow them, but the terms and conditions are legally binding. And here, we're not allowed to thin within 100 feet of existing coho habitat, coho-bearing streams. We interpret that as coho-bearing streams not just identified critical habitat. If we identify a stream that wasn't necessarily identified as critical habitat, yet it has coho in it, we manage it as if it was critical habitat. So we're staying away from those areas. And we're also directed to maintain existing shade on all perennial streams. That was also in the terms and conditions. So you could see how that might be a little bit limiting and what your active management opportunities would be. I want to go to an example here of a area on the West Alsea Landscape Management Project where the terms and conditions I just showed you apply. And what we have here is in the lower reaches of the Alsea River, Drift Creek, and this is an area that's subject to head of tide. The areas that are outlined in yellow are densely stocked stands. They are approximately 26 years old. This entire area of Lower Alsea, we call it the Oxbow. For 60 years, it was managed as a homestead, and it was managed for agriculture, primarily livestock grazing and growing hay. It was then sold to a private timber company, and in 2003, the Forest Service received ownership of this parcel. And the areas that are highlighted in yellow up here, this and down here, and there's more that would extend off the map. This clip doesn't include it all. Those are areas where we're not allowed to thin with the standards that we were given in terms and conditions from NOAA Fisheries. We're simply too close to occupied coho habitat in Drift Creek. Now, the next shot I'm going to give you is right up here, and it's adjacent to Drift Creek. It's a riparian area. It's a stand that we refer to as Mirkwood. There's very little going on underneath, as you can see. The stand is 26 years old. It was planted for intensive timber management. We've inherited that now in 2003 as Forest Service. And given the terms and conditions that we have now, we really cannot do any active management in that stand. I'd like to just switch to a little bit of an overview of the Siuslaw Forest, just to give you a scope of the situation. Approximately a third of our forest is in plantations, 200,000 acres. And those plantations are 90% Douglas fir. At one time, the forest annual harvest was 350 million board feet. And as you know, that's been greatly reduced. It's down to slightly over 30 million. The only thing we do for timber harvest now is commercial thinning of those plantations. We're not harvesting any more large trees. So the terms and conditions that we're receiving are specific to the actions we would take in commercial thinning of those old plantations. We also have the opportunity to use the aquatic restoration biological opinion for non-commercial riparian vegetation treatments. We do a little bit of that, and we have that opportunity. It's a bit more expensive, and it would require an individual NEPA project, not tied to a landscape management project typically, and funding other than, it would be restoration funding other than what we might be available. So that you cannot use the commercial timber sale as a tool to do that kind of work. I've listed some of the ESA listed species here at the bottom of the page, and I'll just mention that the Pacific Eulachon was the smelt, Columbia River smelt, just recently listed. We're getting more and more endangered species, not less and less. We're not recovering species and getting them off the list. We're getting more. So the project isn't getting smaller. The opportunities to manage for listed species and their habitats, I think, is probably expanding. The East Alsea Landscape Management Plan project, I want to show you an example of the scope of the type of work we're proposing. This is the Alsea Landscape Management Planning area. It's East Alsea, just upstream, of course, from West Alsea. And you might focus on the descriptors there on the lower left-hand corner about the amount of activity that could be proposed. The units that are in red are units that we would propose to thin within 100 feet of coho habitat. And there's the opportunity, about 900 acres of thinning. It is possible that we would thin, and that could be up to 6% of the stream miles in this watershed. Of course, 25% of the area is within 100 feet of perennial streams. NOAA is not just concerned about occupied habitat, they're also concerned about perennial streams. This next slide really focuses on those units that really are within 100 feet of coho habitat where we would like to do some thinning. And what we're actually proposing here is to actively thin 6.3 acres within 100 feet of coho habitat. Now, the proposal that you see, it isn't just spread out over area, it's also spread out over time. The timber sales for East Alsea would sell over a period of 5 years, and they may take as long as 10 years to log. So in any given year, you may or may not have any logging. Then again, you may have 1 or 2 units log out. And so in my estimation, that's a pretty small impact to occupied coho habitat, and it is definitely spread out over space and time, yet NOAA considered that detrimental enough to rearing occupied habitat, coho juveniles, that they issued us terms and conditions on how we might conduct that activity. Now I want to switch to the Siuslaw Basin on our national forest, and we're gonna look at this area up here. This is Indian Creek. In fact, that little watershed area is Upper Indian. And I just want to take you on a little road trip. We're going to be looking at Indian Creek. Indian Creek at the 6-field Huck level, you can see the acres. You'll notice that 85% of the watershed is in federal ownership and 15% in private. What's pretty typical for us, and Indian Creek is just a good example of what you'll find on the Siuslaw Forest. The private ownership extends up the valley bottoms. That's what was homesteaded. That was the high priority prime land for homesteading, and it's what is retained in private ownership. And that's why it isn't any surprise to anybody that 80% of the high intrinsic potential habitat for coho is on private land. So even in this watershed, where we only see 15% of the watershed being occupied in private land, they really have the majority of the best coho habitat. So what does that habitat look like? This is starting a road trip here at the bottom of Upper Indian Creek. We're going to start at the bottom and just take a look at private land ownership and what's going on. Pretty much it's in cow pasture right now and being actively managed. It looks like probably year-round occupancy of cattle ranching. This is also a piece of private property, and it's not being grazed, and there's some opportunity there for some trees to grow, and so not all private property is pasture, but still a good portion of it is. A little further up the watershed and some more grazing, and you can see there's a bit more riparian vegetation there. Now this is on the National Forest, and it's just a little bit downstream from one of the units that we're going to visit now. We're going to take a look at 2 units that are being logged, two of our units that are proposed that were actually thinned, and we'll get some aerial views of that. And before we do that, I just want to give you a little pictorial of how do you get to a densely stocked stand. We don't do this anymore, And it took a little bit of work for us to actually come up with these slides because this isn't happening much on our forest. So, of course, you begin with cut it back and burn it black. And then you move right in with planting. Oftentimes the reforestation was done as the unit was still smoldering, at least shortly after it was burned. The lower left-hand corner picture would be a shot of what a unit would look like after it had been burned and planted. And then on the bottom right-hand is densely stocked stand, more than 600 trees per acre, planted probably on an 8x8 grid. And it was intensely stocked. It was intense forest management. It was meant to be actively managed. At no time did anybody think we were going to walk away from a plantation like this and just let it naturally grow and see what it would produce. So in the lower right-hand corner, we're going to take a look at the circled unit there, and the very tip of that unit is actually the thinning unit that we're going to zero in on. And this is what that thinning unit looks like. You can see over here where the unit has been thinned. What was shown in yellow is occupied coho habitat. And just the tip of that unit is what was actually thinned. And as you can see, we didn't really get very close to the riparian area. And I think that's pretty typical of the way we're approaching things right now as far as what we can and can't do. Now, if the wildlife people had some objectives that they'd like to meet that might require a little more activity in the riparian area, I really don't think we can do that right now, given the consultation terms and conditions that we have for coho. We'll take a look at another unit. This is at the upper end of the Upper Indian, and as you can see, it's also near the very headwaters, the most extreme of coho occupancy. And this is what that unit looks like. You can see the thinned unit. It's right over here. This is the area that was thinned. It's next to some private forest land. They do a better job of early seral than we do. And this, the red underneath this blue stream through the middle here, that is occupied coho habitat. Coming out of that is probably a perennial stream. It may or may not have coho in it. I'm really not sure, but we also stayed away from the stream edge and didn't get very aggressive in restoration activities. So the reasons to thin a plantation, I'll let you read those. I think you could already tell they really don't appear to be self-thinning, and we don't think we're going to reach very many aquatic conservation strategy or Northwest Forest Plan objectives unless we do actively thin. Just a brief look at a little bit of data here. I'd like you to focus on the gray slides. This is what you would expect to create 24-inch diameter trees through time if you thinned to 260, I believe it's 276 trees per acre. What's in orange triangles is the ability of that 276 tree per acre stand to produce small wood. Small wood that might have the potential to fall into a stream nearby that could either be a perennial stream or occupied coho. And as you can see, it takes 60 years before you begin to really develop a tree that's large enough to even provide small wood. And of course, through time, the ability of that stand to produce small wood decreases. And the black bars are what we might expect as far as that stand to produce large wood, 24 inches diameter trees with a 65 tree per acre thinning. So what might a stand look like that's adjacent to our streams? And this is an unthinned stand. So some of the harvest prescriptions that we're using, I'll let you read that. First row of conifers within 100 feet. We're going to leave 2 rows. Then if it's an intermittent stream or a smaller stream within 100 feet, We're going to leave one row of conifers. And we'd like to thin within 40 to 100 trees per acre. This is a stand that's unthinned. It's in a riparian area. You'll notice that the trees, two of them, you'll see they're snapped off about halfway up. And what I've seen from a suppression mortality tree is they die from the top down, and they tend to snap in half. And when the wood hits the forest floor, in many cases, by the time I've gotten there and looked at it, you can tear it apart with your hands. It's fairly well decomposed, and I don't really see any mechanism for this to be delivered to the stream channel. So what does a 2-tree row buffer look like? And this is an example of a 2-tree row buffer. What does an intermittent stream look like on the Sayusa National Forest in the Coast Range? This is an example of an intermittent stream. An intermittent stream would have a defined stream channel. You can't see that through the vegetation here. This is a perennial stream. This particular stream does have some coho, and it's more of a natural stand, very scattered conifer upslope, some alder down below, fairly steep side slopes. This is a little larger stream, also a perennial stream, a coho-bearing stream, and it's another shot of what a natural coho-producing stream might look like. So just a few of the observations that I've made. Past harvest really left us with a tree farm on 1/3 of the Sayusa National Forest. So what are we going to do with that? The direction we're really getting from NMFS is to maintain that tree farm through passive management in riparian areas, and just let time have its way with those stands. The Forest Service is really proposing active management to some degree in order to meet our aquatic conservation strategy objectives. And at this point, 4 years of actively attempting to get an independent science review to resolve our disagreement really hasn't gotten us anywhere. We've been unable to ask the question. I'd like to say the disagreement has been floundering in what I call the court of process. You know, our judicial system really is a court of law. It's not a court of truth. And what I find here is that the process problems we have now in our disagreements with NOAA fisheries, they're being dealt with in the court of process, not the court of science. And we would like to see that changed. One of the things that I've noticed is that executives do not embarrass executives. And if in order to get a resolution or to even ask the question might embarrass somebody, chances are you're not going to ask the question. And this problem might go unresolved for years. Now, Cindy didn't want to read some of the things that I had put in my biography, and I hope you question that too. Why would a guy say he got this award in 1992? Well, I've been around for a while, and I'm working with the same people at NOAA Fisheries that I was working with in 1992. The players don't change. The disagreement hasn't changed, and we still haven't gotten any closer to resolution. So I'm really hoping that our executives here in some newer efforts that we're making really will tackle some of these disagreements and get us a little closer to some resolution. But as you might guess, I'm kind of frustrated. Some of the disagreements may never get resolved. I really don't know. I hope they do. I really do. But since I do work for an action agency, I wanted to close with an action shot of me at my desk. And as you'll notice, they keep me in the basement. And I think a reason for that might be because if I were to jump out the window, I'd actually have to jump up to hit the ground. So, thank you very much.